The Mafia boss was lifting a forkful of osso buco to his lips when a cold, gloved hand brushed his shoulder. Not a rival's blade, not a federal badge, just a silver tray trembling slightly. He looked up. A young waiter stood over him, eyes darting to the shadows of the restaurant, his white knuckles gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Sir," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the clink of crystal, "I shouldn't be the one to tell you." Enzo's enforcers moved instantly. Chairs scraped against marble, hands vanished into tailored jackets. Too close, too fast. But Enzo raised a single diamond-ringed hand, freezing the room. No one interrupted his dinner. People waited until he was finished to speak. He set his fork down, leaning back to look the boy in the eye. "What is so important that it ruins a vintage Barolo, Julian?" The waiter swallowed hard, leaning in until the scent of expensive cologne and cheap anxiety mingled. "I'm telling you because the men at the door are already on his side," he breathed. That made Enzo pause. The boy leaned closer, his voice a ghost of a tremor. "The vault at the estate is empty. Your brother took the money, sir. And he didn't go alone." That's when Enzo noticed the way his brother, Lucien, sat perfectly still across the table. The way the background enforcers weren't looking at the door, but at the back of Enzo's head, and the faint, unmistakable click of a safety being switched off under the tablecloth. The Mafia boss slowly took the linen napkin from his lap, not because he was finished eating, but because the betrayal he had just been handed was a debt that could only be settled in blood. Stick around until the very end because the secret Enzo Valenti is about to uncover in that golden dining room at La Lanterna will leave you breathless. You think you know what happens when a mafia boss faces a total betrayal by his own blood, but you have no idea how this one dinner is about to change everything. Before we move into the lone wolf of the East Side and the silent signal that saved his life, make sure to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. The chandelier at La Lanterna did not just illuminate the room. It seemed to bow before Enzo Valenti, casting a golden, reverent glow over the silver-rimmed china and the deep crimson of the vintage Barolo. To the casual observer, this was merely a high-end dinner in the heart of the city. But to those who understood the invisible geography of power, this was a coronation ceremony that occurred every Tuesday night. Zoe sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his heavy, imposing frame filling the space with a gravitational pull that drew every eye in the room. At 60, he was a man built of granite and old-world secrets, his dark hair slicked back with a precision that matched his business dealings, graying at the temples like a frost that had survived 1,000 winters. He took a slow, methodical bite of his osso buco, the rich marrow, a testament to the fact that he only consumed the finest life had to offer. Around him, the restaurant hummed with the orchestrated symphony of a kingdom at peace. Across from him sat Lucien, his younger brother by 12 years. Lucien was the mirror image of Enzo's youth, slimmer, perhaps a bit more refined in his movements but lacking the weathered calluses of a man who had built an empire from the blood-soaked soil of the docks. Lucien laughed at a joke made by one of the captains, his teeth white and perfect, his silk tie shimmering under the lights. To Enzo, Lucien was the future, the legacy he had spent 30 years protecting. He watched his brother with a paternal pride that softened the usual hardness of his furrowed brow. He believed that the Valenti name was now unassailable, a fortress of loyalty that no rival family dared to siege. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive tobacco, and the intoxicating perfume of absolute security. Enzo felt the weight of the gold signet ring on his finger, a symbol of the authority that allowed him to sit in the center of this world, undisturbed and untouchable. To his left, Marco, his most trusted enforcer, stood like a silent sentinel. Marco's hand remained low, hovering near the edge of the table, a professional habit that Enzo found comforting rather than alarming. In the background, other men in tailored dark suits occupied the peripheral tables, their presence turning the public dining room into a private fortress. These were Enzo's disciples, men who had sworn blood oaths to the Valenti crest. The restaurant's owner had cleared the floor of outsiders, ensuring that the boss could dine without the intrusion of the mundane world. It was the peak of Enzo's reign. The unions were settled, the shipping lanes were clear, and the police commissioners were effectively on the payroll. He was a man who had reached the summit and found the air to be exactly as sweet as he had imagined. Every clink of a crystal glass sounded like a coin dropping into a vault that would never be emptied. As the second course was cleared, Enzo leaned forward, the heavy silk of his three-piece suit whispering against the tablecloth. He looked at Lucien and raised his glass, the red wine catching the light like a giant ruby. "To family," Enzo said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded instant silence from the rest of the table. "To the blood that keeps us together and the loyalty that keeps us alive." Lucien raised his glass in return, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips that Enzo interpreted as shared affection. The captains joined the toast, their voices a rhythmic chorus of "To family," echoing off the vaulted ceilings. At that precise moment, Enzo felt a rare sense of tranquility. He believed he had finally achieved the impossible in their line of work. He had reached the top without losing his soul or his kin. He was the sun around which the entire Valenti universe orbited, warm and blindingly bright. However, beneath the surface of this perfect evening, a subtle shift was occurring in the atmosphere, one that Enzo's instincts, honed by decades of survival, began to register with a faint, prickly heat at the back of his neck. He noticed that the background figures, his loyal soldiers, were no longer scanning the entrance with their usual vigilance. Instead, their gazes seemed to linger on the back of his head, or flicker toward Lucien with a strange, expectant intensity. The rhythmic clink of silverware began to sound less like a dinner, and more like the ticking of a hidden clock. Even the shadows in the corners of the opulent room seemed to stretch and deepen, encroaching on the golden light of the chandelier. Enzo's jaw tightened, a microscopic adjustment that only a man in his position would recognize as the first sign of a predator sensing a trap. He glanced at his plate, where the once appetizing pasta now looked cold and stagnant. The waiter, Julian Thorne, began to move toward the table with a bottle of sparkling water. Enzo had known Julian for years. The young man was the son of a former driver who had died in service to the Valentes. Julian was a ghost in white linen, a boy who had grown up in the hallways of Enzo's estate, silent and observant. As Julian approached, Enzo saw the sweat beading on the young man's upper lip, despite the cool air of the restaurant. Julian didn't look at the bottle he was holding. His eyes were fixed on Enzo with a desperate, vibrating focus. The enforcers nearby didn't move to intercept him as they usually would. They remained strangely still, their hands resting on their laps or hidden beneath the white linen of their own tables. The silence that had followed the toast stretched too long, turning from a mark of respect into an oppressive, heavy weight that filled the lungs. Lucien reached for a breadstick, his movements casual, yet there was a new tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there 10 minutes prior. He didn't look at Enzo, he looked at the wine glass in his own hand, watching the liquid swirl with an almost hypnotic fascination. The air in the room grew thin, as if the oxygen were being siphoned out by the sheer pressure of the unspoken. Enzo felt the first real pang of suspicion, a cold needle of doubt that pierced through his armor of pride. He realized that the Last Supper wasn't just a metaphor for his weekly routine. It was beginning to feel like a literal description of the night. Every detail he had curated to signal his power, the private room, the loyal guards, the presence of his brother, was being inverted, transformed into the walls of a cage that was slowly closing in on him. Julian Thorne reached the table, the silver tray in his left hand shaking with a frantic, rhythmic tremor that caused the glassware to rattle like dry bones. He leaned down, ostensibly to refresh Enzo's water, but his body blocked the view of the men at the peripheral tables. The proximity was a violation of protocol, a breach that Marco should have corrected with a sharp word or a firm hand, yet Marco remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall. Enzo felt the heat of the waiter's breath against his ear, a sharp contrast to the icy chill that was beginning to settle in his gut. The golden ring on Enzo's finger felt suddenly heavy, a leaden weight that threatened to pull his hand down through the table. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He waited for the whisper that he knew, with the terrifying clarity of a doomed man, was about to change the world. The transition from the peak of his power to the precipice of his destruction took only a heartbeat. Enzo Valenti, the man who had seen every kind of evil and orchestrated much of it, braced himself. He could feel the eyes of his brother Lucien finally lifting to meet his, not with the love of a sibling, but with the cold, calculating hunger of a successor who had tired of waiting. The opulence of La Lanterna, with its basil-scented air and velvet curtains, suddenly felt like a tomb. As the waiter's lips moved, Enzo realized that the most dangerous weapon in the room wasn't the handgun hidden under the tablecloth or the enforcers standing in the shadows. It was the truth that was about to be uttered in a frantic, terrifying hush. The dinner was over, though the plates were still full, and the bill for Enzo's blind loyalty was finally being presented for payment in full. The vibration of the silver tray against the mahogany table was a frantic telegraph, a rhythmic rattling of crystal that only Enzo seemed to hear over the low, ambient hum of the restaurant. Julian Thorne leaned in, his body creating a narrow, temporary curtain between the boss and the rest of the room. The scent of starch and cold sweat replaced the aroma of the slow-cooked veal. Enzo did not flinch. He did not turn his head. He remained a statue of Sicilian stone, his eyes fixed on the across-the-table silhouette of his brother Lucien, who was currently peeling a grape with a clinical, detached precision. The waiter's voice was a ghost's breath, a sliver of sound that cut through the golden atmosphere of La Lanterna like a serrated blade through silk. "Sir," Julian whispered, the words trembling but precise. "The vault at the estate is empty. Your brother took the money an hour ago. He didn't go alone. He's made a deal with the Morello family. The men at the doors, they aren't yours anymore." The air in Enzo's lungs turned to lead. It was a physical sensation, a sudden thickening of the atmosphere that made every breath a labor of will. He felt the wine in his stomach sour, the expensive Barolo transforming into a bitter, acidic vinegar that burned his throat. The betrayal didn't come as a sudden explosion, but as a series of interlocking realizations that clicked into place with terrifying speed. He looked at Marco, his loyal enforcer on the left, and saw for the first time the rigid, unnatural stillness in the man's posture. Marco wasn't guarding the door. He was guarding the exit, his hand not just near his jacket, but firmly gripped around the hilt of a weapon that was now pointed at Enzo's ribs beneath the heavy drape of the white linen. The Last Supper had moved from a metaphor to a tactical reality. Enzo's furrowed brow deepened, his jaw tightening until the muscles ached, yet he kept his hands flat on the table, a masterclass in restrained fury. Julian continued to pour the water, the liquid splashing into the glass with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the sudden, psychic silence that had descended upon Enzo's world. "They're waiting for the dessert course, sir," the waiter breathed, his eyes wide and glazed with the terror of a man caught between two colliding planets. "Lucien told them to wait for your signal to toast. That's when they'll do it." Julian's fingers brushed Enzo's sleeve, a fleeting human contact that felt like a plea for mercy. The young man was risking a slow death to deliver this truth, a debt of gratitude to a father Enzo had buried 20 years ago. Enzo finally shifted his gaze, not to the waiter, but to his brother. Lucien had finished with his grape and was now looking up, his eyes bright with a predatory, expectant light. The younger Valenti smiled, a gesture that had once signaled shared secrets but now felt like the baring of a wolf's teeth in the moonlight. Enzo felt a coldness settle behind his ribs, a winter that had nothing to do with the air conditioning of the restaurant. He thought of the millions stored in the exit fund, the untraceable cash and bearer bonds meant to protect the family if the federal government ever moved in. It was the lifeblood of the Valenti legacy, and Lucien had drained it to buy his way into a partnership with their bitterest rivals. The betrayal was absolute. It was a violation of the very marrow of their bones. As Julian straightened up, pulling the silver tray back to his chest like a shield, Enzo realized he was sitting in a beautifully decorated tomb. Every man in the room, from the captains at the side tables to the enforcers by the kitchen, had been bought with his own stolen money. The hierarchy he had spent a lifetime building had inverted in a single hour, leaving him at the bottom of a pit he had dug himself. The packing of the room changed. The background chatter, once a comfort, now felt like a predatory hiss. Enzo noticed the subtle movements of the men at the peripheral tables, the way they adjusted their chairs to face him, the way their eyes never left his hands. He was being studied like a specimen under glass. He looked down at his water glass, the bubbles rising to the surface and popping with a quiet finality. He could feel the weight of the handgun Marco held under the table, a cold presence that seemed to radiate heat. Lucien picked up his wine glass again, swirling the deep red liquid with a casual, practiced elegance. "Everything all right, Enzo?" Lucien asked, his voice smooth and devoid of the tremor that should have accompanied such a monumental treason. "You look like you've seen a ghost, or perhaps the wine is finally catching up to you." Enzo's fingers twitched against the mahogany, the gold signet ring catching the light. He had a choice to make in the next 60 seconds. He could succumb to the paralysis of heartbreak, or he could become the monster the world expected him to be. He looked at Julian, who was retreating into the shadows of the service station, his role as a messenger complete. The waiter had given him the only weapon he had left, information. Enzo's mind, a machine built for strategic violence, began to map the room. He counted 8 men directly loyal to Lucien, 4 Morello infiltrators near the kitchen, and Marco, the turncoat, at his elbow. The odds were impossible, a death sentence written in fine dining and silk ties. Yet, as the bitterness of the soured wine hit the back of his tongue, a spark of the old Enzo, the man who had survived the docks of the 70s, flickered back to life. He didn't respond to Lucien's taunt immediately. Instead, he reached for his own glass, his hand steady, his movements a mirror of his brother's calm. He felt the eyes of the entire room boring into him, waiting for the crack in his facade, the moment the lion realized the cage was locked. He inhaled the scent of the wine, which now smelled of copper and rot, and forced a thin, grim smile to his lips. He was the patriarch, the central-seated man, and he would not die while someone else was holding his fork. The emotional arc of the night had reached its nadir, a descent from the heights of familial pride into the darkest depths of fratricidal war. He saw the armed man on the left tighten his grip, the fabric of the dark suit stretching over the knuckles of the hand, holding the handgun low and close to the table. Enzo leaned forward, the heavy silk of his suit whispering against the edge of the mahogany. He looked directly at Lucien, cutting through the younger man's smug veneer with a gaze that had terrified judges and congressmen alike. The tension in the room was a physical cord, stretched so tight it hummed. "The wine is fine, Lucien," Enzo said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried the weight of a funeral bell. "It's just that I've suddenly developed a taste for something much stronger." He saw the flicker of doubt in Lucien's eyes, a momentary hesitation that proved his brother was still a student in a master's house. The secret Julian had whispered was now a shared burden, a silent explosion that had already leveled the foundations of their home. The guns were drawn, the money was gone, and the dinner was about to end in a way that no one in La Lanterna would ever forget. Enzo's mind retreated from the suffocating tension of the restaurant, diving back through the layers of time to the cold, subterranean silence of the Valenti estate's basement. The vault was not a mere safe. It was a sanctuary of steel and concrete, a cathedral of contingency that Enzo had built brick by paranoid brick over 30 years. He remembered the heavy, metallic sigh of the door swinging open, revealing the exit fund, neatly shrink-wrapped towers of $100 bills, rows of bearer bonds, and velvet-lined cases of uncut diamonds. To Enzo, this was not money to be spent on fast cars or vanity. It was the insurance policy for their bloodline, the price of freedom should the world ever turn against them. He had brought Lucien down there on his 21st birthday, showing him the hoard as if it were a holy relic. He had explained that this was the weight of their responsibility, a burden to be guarded, not a prize to be consumed. But as Enzo stared at his brother across the dinner table in the present, he finally saw the memory of that day through Lucien's eyes. While Enzo had seen a shield, Lucien had seen a cage. To the younger brother, the vault represented every sacrifice Enzo had forced him to make in the name of a legacy he hadn't asked for. Lucien had grown up in the long, cold shadow of a living legend, expected to be a carbon copy of a man forged in a different era. Every time Lucien had proposed a new venture, investments in tech, digital currencies, or offshore developments, Enzo had crushed the idea with a wave of his diamond-ringed hand, pointing toward the vault. "We stay with what we know," Enzo would rumble, his voice a hammer of tradition. "The money stays in the wall where it's safe. We don't gamble with the future of this family." Enzo had mistaken Lucien's obedient silence for agreement, never realizing that he was feeding a hunger that could only be satisfied by total destruction. Lucien felt he deserved the vault because he believed he was the one truly paying for it with his life. He was tired of being the prince in waiting, the elegant subordinate who handled the paperwork while Enzo dictated the terms of their existence. The younger Valenti resented the way Enzo treated the money as a stagnant monument rather than a tool for expansion. To Lucien, the exit fund was a tether that kept them anchored to the old ways, to the docks and the protection rackets and the gritty, archaic violence of the 70s. He felt that the millions in that vault were a debt owed to him, for every night he had spent playing the role of the loyal student, for every no he had endured, and for the suffocating pressure of being a Valenti without being the Valenti in charge. He didn't want to protect the family's soul. He wanted to fund a kingdom where he was the architect, not just the heir. The plan to empty the vault had begun as a whisper in Lucien's mind months ago, fueled by the Morello family's predatory promises. They had seen the fracture in the Valenti foundation long before Enzo had. They had whispered to Lucien that a man of his vision shouldn't be asking for an allowance from an older brother who was becoming a relic. They told him that the money in the wall was rotting, just like Enzo's grip on the city. Lucien had spent weeks memorizing the tumblers of the vault, a sequence he had practiced until his fingertips bled. The night he finally opened it, the silence of the estate felt like an accusation, but the sight of the empty shelves filled him with a dark, intoxicating rush of liberation. He wasn't just taking currency. He was taking Enzo's power, stripping the lion of his claws before the final confrontation at La Lanterna. In Lucien's mind, the betrayal was an act of survival. He convinced himself that Enzo was leading them toward a cliff, clinging to a code of honor that no longer existed in a world of wiretaps and globalized crime. By taking the money, Lucien believed he was saving the Valenti name by rebranding it, even if it meant stepping over his brother's corpse to do so. He felt a righteous indignation that burned hotter than greed. He deserved the diamonds because he was the one who would have to navigate the fallout of Enzo's eventual downfall. He deserved the cash because he was the one willing to do what Enzo wouldn't, make a deal with the enemy to secure a seat at the new table. The vault was empty because Lucien had decided that the only way to truly inherit the empire was to burn the emperor's treasury to the ground. Back in the present, the gold ring on Enzo's hand felt like a shackle, a reminder of the wealth that was no longer there to protect him. He could almost see the ghosts of those $100 bills floating in the space between him and his brother, a paper wall that had finally collapsed. He realized that while he had been teaching Lucien how to guard the vault, the Morellos had been teaching him how to pick the lock. The emotional style of their brotherhood had been built on a foundation of unspoken resentment, a quiet rot that had finally reached the surface. Enzo had thought he was building a sanctuary, but he had actually built a resentment so large that no vault could contain it. The wine in his glass was still vinegar, a bitter reminder that the most expensive things in life are the ones you think you've already paid for in full. Across the table, Lucian's smug expression was the look of a man who had finally cashed a check 30 years in the making. He didn't care about the blood on the money or the lives that would be shattered by the Morello alliance. He only cared that the vault was empty and his pockets were full. The tragedy of the Valenti line was not that it was being ended by an outsider, but that it was being sold off by its own fruit. Enzo's jaw remained tight, his eyes fixed on the man he had once held as an infant. He saw the greed, the entitlement, and the profound misunderstanding of what power actually cost. Lucian thought he had bought his freedom, but Enzo knew that the money in that vault had been the only thing keeping the wolves from the door. Now that the vault was empty, there was nothing left but the cold steel of the handguns and the long, dark night ahead. The flashback faded, leaving Enzo in the harsh, golden light of the restaurant, the reality of the empty vault settling into his bones like a terminal fever. He was a king without a treasury, a boss without a crew, and a brother without a family. The structural breakdown of his life was complete. All the years of protecting the legacy had resulted in this, a dinner where the only thing on the menu was his own demise. He felt the weight of the handgun Marco held under the table, and he knew that Lucian was waiting for the final signal. The vault was empty, the guns were drawn, and the history of the Valenti family was about to be written in a red ink that no amount of stolen money could ever wash away. Enzo took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying his heart for the violence that was the only currency he had left to spend. Enzo Valenti did not move his head, but his world expanded through the peripheral vision he had spent 40 years sharpening into a weapon. The opulent dining room of La Lanterna, once his fortress of marble and velvet, began to deconstruct itself into a tactical map of betrayal. He was no longer looking at men he had dined with for decades. He was looking at variables in a lethal equation. He started with the two men at the table nearest the kitchen, Sal and Frankie. Normally, they were the loudest in the room, their laughter a boisterous endorsement of Enzo's humor. Tonight, they sat in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. Sal was methodically shredding a sourdough roll into tiny, useless crumbs, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth with the intense focus of a man avoiding a death sentence. He wouldn't look up because to look at Enzo was to acknowledge the ghost he was about to become. Their loyalty had been bought not with a better offer, but with the fear that Lucian's new world had no room for the old guard. His gaze drifted toward the far corner, where the shadows of the arched entrance pooled like spilled ink. Standing there was Nico, a young soldier Enzo had personally bilaid out of a dozen scrapes. Nico was checking his watch with a rhythmic, nervous frequency that betrayed the timeline of the coming execution. His jacket was unbuttoned, the hem hitched up just enough to reveal the unmistakable silhouette of a high-capacity subcompact tucked into his waistband. In the old days, no man entered Enzo's presence with a round chambered and a safety off unless they were facing an external threat. Now, Nico's body language was tilted inward, his shoulders squared not toward the street, but toward the back of Enzo's neck. The boy's eyes were glassy, reflecting the cold light of the chandelier with a vacant stare that suggested he had already checked out of his conscience. He was no longer a protege, he was a countdown clock. Further back, near the mahogany bar, the Morello infiltrators sat like vultures in tailored wool. Enzo recognized the man in the charcoal suit as Sloane, Morello's primary fixer. The man wasn't eating. He was sipping an espresso with a clinical detachment, his eyes scanning the room with the professional coldness of a foreman overseeing a demolition. He didn't belong in this neighborhood, let alone this restaurant, yet the Valenti soldiers nearby treated him with a terrifying, deferential space. The borders of Enzo's kingdom had not just been breached, they had been redrawn while he was busy enjoying his appetizer. Every background figure he had once considered a pillar of his community was now a structural weakness. He saw the way the waitstaff moved, avoiding his table as if the air around him were radioactive. Even the maitre d', a man who had bowed to Enzo for 20 years, was currently hiding behind the reservation podium, his face as pale as the napkins he clutched. Enzo's internal scan shifted to the men directly behind Lucien. These were the younger crew, the boys who had grown up on digital schemes and offshore laundering, men who viewed Enzo's code of blood and honor as a quaint, unprofitable superstition. They looked at Enzo with a mixture of pity and predatory hunger, the way a wolf looks at an aging alpha whose limp has finally become a liability. They were whispering among themselves, their hands moving in quick, sharp gestures that mimicked the drawing of blades. To them, Enzo wasn't a man. He was an obstacle to a faster payday. He saw the way they glanced at Lucien for the go signal, their bodies coiled with a restless energy that threatened to shatter the formal atmosphere of the room. The betrayal was a contagion, and it had infected every corner of the room until there was no untainted air left for Enzo to breathe. The most painful discovery came when Enzo's eyes finally settled on Marco, the man standing inches from his left shoulder. Marco had been Enzo's shadow since the mid-90s, the man who knew the names of Enzo's children and the location of every secret ledger. Marco's hand remained low, but Enzo noticed the slight, repetitive clenching of his jaw, a tell Marco only displayed when he was committing to a move he knew he couldn't take back. The handgun Marco held under the table wasn't just a tool, it was a signature on a confession. Marco didn't look at Enzo because he couldn't face the shadow of the man he was murdering. The silence between them, once filled with the comfortable weight of shared history, was now a vacuum. Enzo realized that his blind loyalty had not just been a flaw, it had been an invitation. He had built a world where he was the only one who believed the lies they told each other to stay sane. As he completed his scan, the emotional arc of the night hit its true bottom. He was surrounded by 22 men, and not a single soul in the room was willing to die for him. The hierarchy was gone, replaced by a brutal, immediate democracy of the gun. He looked at the plate of pasta in front of him, the steam rising in a lazy, mocking swirl. He felt the gold ring on his finger grow cold, as if the metal were reacting to the loss of his authority. He was the central-seated man, but the chair felt like a throne made of ice that was rapidly melting. The tension was no longer a whisper, it was a roar in his ears, a symphony of shifting fabric and clicking safeties. He saw the armed man on the left shift his weight, the final adjustment before the draw. The room was no longer a restaurant, it was a kill box, and he was the only target. Lucien caught Enzo's eye, his smile widening as he realized the boss had finished his assessment. "You see it now, don't you, Enzo?" Lucien asked, his voice a silken thread of cruelty. "You've been scanning the room like a man looking for a friend, but there are no friends left in La Lanterna, only business partners." Lucien leaned back, spreading his hands as if to encompass the entire theater of betrayal. "You built this room to keep the world out, but you forgot to check who you invited inside." The younger brother's arrogance was the final piece of the puzzle. Enzo realized that Lucien hadn't just stolen the money, he had stolen the people. He had turned Enzo's own cult of personality against him, using the boss's own methods to dismantle the boss's life. The tragedy was complete, the scan was finished, and the reality of his isolation settled into Enzo's marrow like a terminal frost. Despite the crushing weight of the revelation, Enzo did not allow his posture to break. He sat with the same heavy, imposing dignity that had defined his reign, even as he felt the metaphorical walls of the restaurant collapsing. He took a final, slow breath, tasting the basil and the copper of the coming violence. He knew that the next 30 seconds would decide if he died as a king or as a relic. He looked at the background figures one last time, the shredders of bread, the checkers of watches, the sippers of espresso, and he didn't feel anger. He felt a profound, weary clarity. They were all waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet, a momentary lag in the betrayal that he might still be able to exploit. The scan was done, the targets were marked, and the Last Supper was moving into its final, bloodiest course. Enzo Valenti tightened his grip on his wine glass, preparing to turn the table. Enzo Valenti did not survive 40 years in the gutter of the East Side by reacting to the world. He survived by anticipating the moment the world would try to break him. While Lucien leaned back, Intoxicated by the theater of his own treason, Enzo's hand moved with a glacier's slow, unstoppable weight toward the edge of the mahogany. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he adjusted the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, turning the crest toward his palm until the cold metal bit into his skin. This was the silent signal, a relic of an era before encrypted apps and burner phones, known only to a handful of men who had been with him since the beginning. He looked past the arrogance in Lucian's eyes and caught the gaze of Marco, the man on the left. Marco was the enforcer currently pressing the barrel of a Glock 19 against Enzo's ribs, but he was also a man who had been Enzo's shadow for half a lifetime. The room held its breath, a coiled spring of violence waiting for the younger brother to speak the final word. Yet the tactical balance was already beginning to groan under the weight of Enzo's invisible maneuver. Marco's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his skin in a rhythmic staccato pulse. He had seen the ring turn. It was a command that bypassed the treachery of the evening, reaching back to a blood oath that predated Lucian's greed. In that single, infinitesimal gesture, Enzo wasn't just a victim. He was the boss again, reminding Marco that while money could buy a man's presence, only history could command his soul. The enforcer's hand, which had been steady as a surgeon's, began to shift. The barrel of the gun did not move away from Enzo, but the pressure changed. It was no longer a threat. It was a connection. Enzo felt the slight, repetitive tapping of the metal against his suit jacket, a Morse code of tactical positioning. Marco was signaling that the men at the peripheral tables were focused on the front of Enzo's chest, leaving their own flanks exposed to the very man they thought was their primary assassin. The predator was being guided by the prey, and the silent signal had turned the kill box into a funnel. Lucian, oblivious to the silent communication occurring inches from his face, took a long, triumphant sip of his wine. "You've lived a long life, Enzo," the younger brother said, his voice dripping with a synthetic pity. "But you've become a ghost haunting your own house. It's time to stop the haunting." Lucian's hand drifted toward his own pocket, likely reaching for the signal that would ignite the room. But Enzo's focus remained on the peripheral figures he had scanned moments before. As the signet ring remained turned, Marco subtly shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the marble floor in a way that sounded like a casual adjustment. To the Morello fixers at the bar and the disloyal soldiers near the kitchen, it looked like Marco was simply bracing himself to pull the trigger. In reality, he was clearing his line of sight. The silent signal had created a pocket of uncertainty in the air, a microscopic lag in the enemy's momentum that Enzo was now preparing to widen into a chasm. Enzo finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves. "You always were too fond of the sound of your own voice, Lucian," he said. The words heavy and deliberate. "You spent so much time talking to the Morellos that you forgot how to listen to your own blood." As he spoke, Enzo's left hand slowly descended from the table, not toward a gun, but toward a specific button sewn into the underside of the mahogany, a relic of the restaurant's days as a Prohibition-era speakeasy. This was the second part of the silent signal. With a sharp, muffled click that was drowned out by the hum of the air conditioning, the primary chandeliers of La Lanterna flickered and died. For 3 seconds, the room was plunged into a tactical, suffocating darkness, broken only by the dim red glow of the exit signs. In those 3 seconds, the Last Supper was formally canceled, and the ghost of the East Side reclaimed his territory with the cold efficiency of a winter storm. In the darkness, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a chair being kicked over and the unmistakable metallic rasp of a slide being racked. Marco, moving with the preternatural speed of a man who had rehearsed this betrayal as a test of faith, spun away from Enzo's side. He didn't fire at the boss. He fired at the man near the reservation podium who had been reaching for a submachine gun. The muzzle flash illuminated Marco's face, a mask of grim, absolute loyalty that Lucian had never truly owned. The tactical balance shifted violently as the disloyal soldiers, blinded by the sudden loss of light and the unexpected direction of the first shots, began to scramble. They had expected a single execution. They found themselves in a crossfire coordinated by a man who had turned the very shadows into his infantry. Enzo did not move from his chair. He sat in the darkness, the central pillar of a world that was tearing itself apart, his signet ring still turned inward. When the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the room in a sickly, flickering orange glow, the scene had been transformed. Two of the Morello infiltrators were on the floor, and the armed man on the left was no longer pointing a gun at Enzo's ribs. Instead, Marco was standing behind Enzo, his weapon leveled at Lucian's chest, his eyes cold and unwavering. The disloyal soldiers near the kitchen were frozen, caught between their new payday and the terrifying realization that the old man wasn't dead yet. Enzo reached out and picked up a piece of bread, his hands as steady as the marble pillars of the restaurant. He looked at his brother, whose face had gone from a mask of triumph to a pale, sweating portrait of pure terror. The silent signal had done more than save Enzo's life. It had exposed the hollowness of Lucian's rebellion. Loyalty wasn't something that could be bought with a stolen vault. It was a language spoken in the dark, and Lucian was illiterate. Lucian's hand was still halfway to his pocket, his fingers trembling so violently that the wine glass he had been holding shattered on the floor. The sound of breaking crystal was the only eulogy for his short-lived coup. "Marco," Lucian gasped, his voice a thin, pathetic reed. "We had a deal. I paid you 3 times what he ever did." Marco didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip on the Glock, the laser sight appearing as a steady, blood-red dot on the center of Lucian's silk tie. Enzo took a bite of the bread, chewing slowly, savoring the taste of a victory that had cost him everything he loved. He looked at the background figures, the men who had been waiting for his death, and watched as they slowly, one by one, lowered their weapons. They were professionals, and they knew when the wind had changed. The tactical balance hadn't just shifted, it had been demolished and rebuilt in Enzo's image. The emotional style of the room had curdled from the heat of betrayal into the sub-zero chill of a reckoning. Enzo stood up slowly, his heavy build filling the flickering light, his shadow stretching across the table until it swallowed his brother whole. He reached out and placed his hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture of thanks that carried the weight of 30 years of shared sins. The silent signal was over, but the message had been delivered with surgical precision. Lucian was no longer a prince or a traitor. He was just a boy who had played with fire in a house made of tinder. Enzo looked at the gold ring on his finger and turned it back to its original position, the Valenti crest once again facing the world. The guns were still drawn, but for the first time that night, Enzo Valenti was the only one who knew exactly where they were pointed. The bill was coming, and he was finally ready to settle the account. The orange emergency lights pulsed like a failing heart, casting long, distorted shadows across the ruins of the dinner table. Enzo Valenti remained standing, a monolith of old-world authority amidst the shattered crystal and the smell of cordite. Across from him, Lucian looked smaller than he had only minutes ago, his expensive silk suit now a wrinkled shroud for his evaporated ambitions. The silence in La Lanterna was no longer the respectful hush of a 5-star establishment. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. Marco stood like a statue at Enzo's shoulder, the red dot of the laser sight unmoving on Lucian's chest, a constant reminder of how thin the line had become between brotherhood and a body bag. Enzo reached out, his thick fingers wrapping around the stem of his wine glass, which had miraculously survived the chaos. He didn't drink. He simply stared at the liquid, his voice a low, terrifying rumble when he finally broke the silence. Was it worth it, Lucian, to trade 30 years of blood for a handful of Morello promises and a vault full of paper? Lucian's breath was coming in ragged, shallow hitches, his eyes darting toward the men at the peripheral tables who had so recently been his co-conspirators. Seeing no salvation there, he turned his gaze back to Enzo, his fear beginning to curdle into a desperate, bitter defiance. "It wasn't just paper, Enzo," Lucian spat, his voice cracking like dry wood. "It was freedom. I'm tired of living in a museum. I'm tired of asking for permission to breathe in a city that you're too old to run anymore. The Morellos see the future. They see the digital markets, the global reach, the clean money. You just see the docks and the dirt. You would have kept that money in the wall until the feds knocked the house down around us. Lucien leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I didn't betray the family. I tried to save it from your ego. I deserved that money because I'm the only one with the sense to spend it before it becomes worthless. Enzo's expression did not change, but the furrow in his brow deepened, a physical manifestation of a heartbreak he refused to voice. He looked at his younger brother with a mixture of pity and profound weariness. "You think the money in that vault was about spending, Lucien?" Enzo asked, his tone almost conversational, which made it all the more chilling. "That money was the weight of our sins. It was the price of every life we took and every law we broke to ensure you could wear that suit and sit in this chair. It was a shield, not a bank account. You took the shield and handed it to the wolves, thinking they'd let you lead the pack." Enzo took a slow step around the table, the marble floor clicking beneath his boots like the cocking of a hammer. "The Morellos don't want a partner, you fool. They want a puppet who knows where the rest of the bodies are buried. You didn't buy a future. You just bought a front row seat to your own execution." The subtext of death was a cold, invisible mist between them, thicker than the smoke still drifting from Marco's weapon. Every word was a tactical maneuver, a final attempt to bridge a gap that had become a canyon. Lucien's lower lip trembled, the reality of his isolation finally beginning to penetrate his shock. He looked at the gold signet ring on Enzo's hand, the same ring that had signaled his downfall. "You always loved the rules more than you loved me," Lucien whispered, a sudden childish resentment leaking into his tone. "You treated me like a soldier, not a brother. You lectured me on loyalty while you built a world where everyone is afraid to speak the truth to your face. I took the money because it was the only thing you couldn't use to lecture me." Lucien's eyes filled with a frantic, glassy light. "Kill me then, Enzo. Do it. But don't sit there and tell me about family when you've spent your whole life making sure I was nothing more than your shadow." Enzo stopped 3 feet from his brother, the flickering orange light making his heavy features look like a mask of ancient tragedy. He felt the weight of the gun in Marco's hand as if it were his own. This was the moment he had feared since the day their father died, the moment the Valenti line would have to decide if it was a family or a business. "I gave you everything, Lucien," Enzo said softly, the gravel in his voice replaced by a raw, jagged edge of grief. "I kept the blood off your hands so you could keep your soul clean. I built the vault so you would never have to know the hunger I felt as a boy. My mistake wasn't treating you like a soldier. My mistake was forgetting that a man who has never bled doesn't understand the value of a wound." Enzo reached out, his hand hovering near Lucien's face, not to strike, but as if to check for a fever. "You traded your brother for Benjamin's. You traded a lifetime of protection for a season of greed." The dialogue was a post-mortem of a relationship that had died long before the first shot was fired. Lucien flinched away from Enzo's hand, his pride the only thing left to him in the ruins of the restaurant. "I'm not a child, Enzo. Stop treating me like one," he roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I made a move. I almost had it. If Marco hadn't stayed with you, I'd be the one standing and you'd be the one begging." The arrogance was a thin veneer over a shattering mind. Lucien looked around at the silent enforcers, his voice dropping to a desperate hiss. Tell him why you were going to flip. Tell him how he's a relic." But no one spoke. The men in the background remained in the shadows, their loyalties reset by the cold reality of Enzo's survival. The Benjamins Lucien had promised them were no longer enough to outweigh the fear of the man standing at the head of the table. Enzo let his hand fall to his side, his fingers brushing the cold fabric of his suit. He felt a profound sense of finality settle into his marrow. The brother he had raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who measured worth in currency and power in betrayal. "You want to know the difference between us, Lucien?" Enzo asked, his voice returning to that low, steady vibration. "You think the money makes the man. I know the man makes the money." You can take every dollar in the wall, but you'll never be a Valenti. You're just a thief with my last name. The subtext of the conversation shifted from the past to the immediate, lethal present. Enzo glanced at Marco, a silent communication passing between them that required no signal. The Morello crew would be arriving soon to check on their investment, and Enzo had to decide if Lucien would be an asset or a liability in the coming storm. The emotional style of the confrontation had reached its peak, a Shakespearean collision of greed and shattered trust. Lucien sank back into his chair, the defiance draining out of him, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who realized he had lost everything. The red dot remained fixed on his heart, a steady reminder of the debt he owed. Enzo looked at his brother one last time, searching for a spark of the boy who had once looked at him with hero worship, but he found only the cold ash of resentment. "The dinner is over, Lucien," Enzo said, his voice flat and devoid of further emotion. "The bill has been calculated and you can't afford to pay it." As he spoke, the sound of heavy tires screeching on the pavement outside signaled the arrival of the rival crew. The dialogue was finished, the blood was cold, and the only thing left was the final, violent settlement of the Valenti account. The screech of tires against the rain-slicked pavement outside La Lanterna sounded like a banshee's wail, a sharp, mechanical intrusion that signaled the end of the psychological war and the beginning of the physical one. Enzo Valenti did not flinch, but he felt the atmosphere in the dining room shift from a stagnant pool of betrayal into a pressurized chamber. The heavy front doors, oak-carved and reinforced with steel, shuddered under the impact of a breaching ram. The Last Supper was officially over, and the restaurant, with its velvet curtains and elegant lighting, was instantly transformed into a gilded cage. Enzo looked at Lucien, whose face had gone from the pale white of fear to the gray of a man who realized he was no longer the architect of the chaos, but merely another piece of furniture to be cleared. The Morello crew had arrived, and they weren't coming to rescue a partner. They were coming to liquidate an asset and erase a legacy in one surgical strike. The first flashbang grenade shattered the stained glass window above the bar, a blinding white eruption that turned the opulent interior into a landscape of jagged shadows and ringing silence. Enzo, moving with a tactical grace that defied his heavy build, dropped low behind the mahogany table, pulling a stunned Julian Thorne down with him. Marco was already in motion, his Glock barking 3 times toward the entrance as the first wave of Morello hitmen surged through the dust and splintered wood. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of ozone and the fine white powder of pulverized plaster. The background figures, the soldiers who had so recently considered flipping their loyalties, were caught in a panicked crossfire. They had expected a peaceful transition of power, a handover of keys and codes, but the Morellos were professionals who believed in clean slates. To the invaders, anyone standing in La Lanterna was a Valenti, and every Valenti had to die tonight. Enzo felt the floorboards vibrate under the weight of the assault. He reached into the waistband of his trousers, drawing a snub-nosed revolver he had kept hidden for emergencies, its cold steel a familiar comfort against his palm. He looked at Lucien, who was curled in a fetal position beneath a side table, his expensive silk suit covered in the debris of the ceiling. The younger brother's eyes were wide and vacant, his mouth moving in a silent prayer or a curse. The freedom he had bought with the family's money had resulted in this, a box of fire and lead where his name meant nothing. Enzo didn't feel anger toward him in that moment, only a profound, weary sadness. The trap hadn't just been set for Enzo, it had been a collective grave prepared for the entire bloodline. The Morellos had used Lucien's greed to unlock the door, and now they were here to burn the house down with everyone inside. The packing of the room became a frantic, staccato rhythm of muzzle flashes and the rhythmic thud of heavy rounds hitting the marble pillars. Marco was pinned down behind the reservation podium, his ammunition running low as he held off 4 shooters equipped with suppressed submachine guns. The tactical balance was a nightmare. Enzo's loyalists were scattered, and the turncoats were being gunned down by the very men they had hoped to serve. La Lanterna, once a symbol of Enzo's unshakable authority, was now a kill box. The exit doors were blocked by a black SUV, its high beams cutting through the smoky interior like twin searchlights, illuminating the carnage. Enzo realized that the Morellos weren't just here for a hit. They were here for a statement. They wanted the city to see the Valenti patriarch die in the ruins of his favorite palace, a public execution disguised as a gangland skirmish. A heavy round punched through the mahogany table inches from Enzo's head, showering him in splinters. He rolled to his left, finding a narrow line of sight toward the kitchen entrance where a Morello fixer was trying to flank Marco. Enzo didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger twice, the kick of the revolver vibrating up his arm. The fixer collapsed, his weapon clattering across the tile. It was the first time Enzo had fired a gun in 10 years, and the old, cold clarity of the docks returned to him like a fever. He wasn't a boss or a brother in this moment, he was a survivor. He looked at Julian, who was shaking so hard his teeth were clicking. "Stay low, kid," Enzo growled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the gunfire. "If you move, you're a target. If you stay, you're a ghost." Julian nodded, his eyes fixed on Enzo as if the older man were the only solid thing left in a world made of glass and lead. The emotional style of the night had reached its most visceral point. The high-class drama of the dinner had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, animalistic reality of the cage. Enzo could hear the Morello leader calling out orders from the street, his voice amplified by a megaphone, demanding that the relic come out with his hands up. It was a taunt designed to break Enzo's pride, but it only steeled his resolve. He looked across the room at the armed man on the left, who was now slumped against a pillar, his life leaking out onto the white linen napkins he had used to hide his weapon. The betrayal felt like a lifetime ago. Now, there was only the immediate grinding necessity of the next 10 seconds. The restaurant was a cage. But Enzo Valenti had spent his entire life learning how to bite through iron bars. Lucian suddenly screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short by a burst of fire that shredded the tablecloth above him. The younger brother scrambled toward Enzo, his face a mask of dirt and tears. "Enzo, I didn't know, they said they just wanted the money," he sobbed, reaching out for the man he had tried to sell. Enzo grabbed Lucian by the collar, dragging him behind the heavy legs of the table. He didn't offer a word of forgiveness, but he didn't push him away. The blood tie was a shackle that neither could escape, even as the walls closed in. Marco managed to toss a fresh magazine toward Enzo, the metal sliding across the floor like a lifeline. The two men shared a brief, intense look, the veteran and his shadow, standing together in the center of a collapsing empire. They were outnumbered 10-1, and the Morellos were closing the circle. The final outcome of the night was still unwritten, but as the kitchen door was kicked open and a second team of hitmen emerged, Enzo knew the transformation was complete. He was no longer the man who sat at the head of the table. He was the man who would die in the trenches. He checked the cylinders of his revolver, the orange light reflecting off the brass casings. The Last Supper had become a banquet of lead, and the bill was finally being settled in the most violent currency imaginable. He looked at the shattered remains of his kingdom, at the brother who had betrayed him, and at the enforcer who had stayed true. The restaurant was a cage, but it was Enzo's cage, and he wasn't going to die quietly. He stood up into a crouch, his eyes fixed on the front door, waiting for the Morellos to realize that a lion is most dangerous when he has nowhere left to run. The air inside La Lanterna was a choking soup of pulverized marble, expensive cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of blood, but amidst the chaos, Julian Thorne ceased to be a trembling waiter. As the Morello hitmen pressed their advantage, shattering the remaining crystal with a relentless barrage, Julian moved with a sudden, fluid confidence that defied his subservient attire. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he reached into the service station's hidden panel, pulling out a small, encrypted tablet that glowed with a cold, blue light. Enzo, pinned behind the mahogany table with the weight of a collapsing dynasty on his shoulders, watched in stunned silence as the young man he had considered a mere ghost began to manipulate the very architecture of the building. This was the revelation of the third eye, a contingency plan Enzo had authorized a decade ago and subsequently forgotten, managed by a boy who had been raised to be the ultimate shadow protector in a world of shifting loyalties. Julian's fingers danced across the screen, and suddenly, the rhythmic thud of the Morello breaching ram was answered by the deep, hydraulic groan of steel shutters descending behind the velvet curtains. These were not decorative fixtures. They were armored plates that turned the restaurant's windows into a bunker. The shadow protector had been monitoring the family's internal communications for months, intercepting the whispers of Lucien's greed long before the first dollar left the vault. While Enzo had been focused on the Last Supper, Julian had been quietly preparing the battlefield. He had known the Morellos would come, and he had known that Lucien's ego would lead them straight to the heart of the Valenti territory. The young man looked at Enzo, his face no longer a mask of anxiety but a portrait of grim, technical focus. He wasn't just a messenger. He was the fail-safe, the silent guardian who ensured that even when blood betrayed blood, the legacy had a way to strike back from the dark. "Sir, the basement freight lift is active," Julian said, his voice now steady and devoid of the waiter's deferential lilt. "I've jammed the Morello frequencies within a 3-block radius. They can't call for reinforcements, and their tactical headsets are nothing but white noise right now." Enzo felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of betrayal from his mind. He realized that Julian's father hadn't just been a driver. He had been Enzo's primary intelligence officer, and the son had inherited the mantle with a terrifying proficiency. The tactical balance shifted once more. By cutting the Morellos off from their command, Julian had turned the cage into a slaughterhouse where the Valentis held the home field advantage. Marco, seeing the shutters drop, took the opportunity to advance, his fire now disciplined and lethal as he picked off the confused hitmen who found themselves trapped in a darkened room with no way to communicate with their leader outside. Julian tapped a final command into the tablet, and the floorboards beneath the bar slid back with a hushed, mechanical hiss, revealing a cache of heavy weaponry that Enzo had forgotten existed. This was the Shadow's armory, a stockpile maintained by the Thorn Line for the day the Valenti patriarch was finally cornered. Julian pulled out a compact submachine gun and handed it to Enzo, the cold polymer a stark contrast to the vintage revolver the boss had been clutching. The emotional style of the night transitioned from the tragedy of the Last Supper to the cold, hard logic of a counterinsurgency. Enzo looked at the boy, now his third eye, and saw a loyalty that was cleaner and sharper than anything his brother had ever offered. Lucien, still huddled in the debris, watched the transformation with a hollow, wide-eyed stare. He had thought he was the modern visionary, but he had been outplayed by a waiter who understood that real power was invisible. The packing of the fight slowed as the Morellos realized they were no longer the hunters. The darkness of the restaurant was now punctuated by the green glow of Julian's tactical overrides. He signaled to Marco using a series of light pulses from the overhead emergency system, guiding the enforcer through the smoke to eliminate the remaining threats in the kitchen. Julian's true role was a testament to Enzo's past paranoia, a secret insurance policy that had matured at the exact moment of total insolvency. As the third eye, Julian saw the heat signatures of the men outside through the building's external sensors, relaying their positions to Enzo with a calm, surgical precision. 3 men by the black SUV, sir. 2 more by the service entrance. They're preparing to use thermite on the back door. Enzo nodded, the heavy submachine gun feeling light in his hands. He was no longer a relic, he was a commander. The transformation of the evening was complete. The restaurant was still a cage, but Julian Thorne had handed Enzo the keys to every exit and the trigger to every trap. The Shadow Protector had turned a fratricidal execution into a lesson in deep-state loyalty. Enzo stood up, the golden light of the tablet reflecting in his suspicious, graying eyes. He looked at Julian and saw the future of the organization, not a brother who stole, but a son of the family who watched from the shadows. The subtext of the night had moved beyond the empty vault and the blood versus Benjamins. It was now about the endurance of the secret structures that held the world together. The Morellos were screaming outside, their megaphone voices distorted by Julian's jamming, and for the first time that night, Enzo Valenti smiled. It was a thin, predatory expression that signaled the beginning of the end for everyone who had stepped into La Lanterna uninvited. Lucien tried to speak, perhaps to claim he was part of the plan or to beg for a place in the escape, but Enzo ignored him entirely. His focus was on the young man in the black vest who had saved his life with a series of keystrokes. "How long have you been watching Julian?" Enzo asked, his voice a low, appreciative rumble. "Since the night your brother first met Sloane Morello at the docks, sir," Julian replied without looking up from the screen. "I've been waiting for the signal to bring the house down." The depth of the third eye's surveillance was staggering. Enzo realized he had been protected by a ghost for months while he slept. The emotional arc hit a new peak of clarity. Loyalty wasn't a toast made over wine. It was a silent, daily labor performed in the dark. The guns were still drawn, but the tactical map was now entirely in Enzo's favor. The final course of the night was being prepared, and it wouldn't be served on silver. Julian signaled that the freight lift was ready, the only path out of the kill box that the Morellos didn't know existed. As the back door began to glow with the white-hot heat of the thermite, Enzo gripped his weapon and looked at his shadow protector. The Last Supper had ended, but the Valenti name would survive the night. Carried into the darkness by a boss who had been reminded that true power doesn't sit at the head of the table, it stands behind it, watching through eyes that never blink. The bill was about to be paid in full, and Enzo Valenti, guided by his third eye, was ready to collect every cent of interest. The freight lift's industrial cage rattled as it rose from the basement, a skeletal iron box that sounded like the ticking of a final clock. The restaurant was now a landscape of orange flickers and drifting soot, the air vibrating with the hissed warnings of Morello hitmen regrouping at the perimeter. Enzo stood in the center of the wreckage, his heavy frame silhouetted against the flickering emergency lights. The submachine gun Julian had provided held with a terrifying, effortless familiarity. To his left, Marco maintained a tactical crouch, his weapon leveled at the kitchen doors, while Julian monitored the tablet, his third eye tracking the thermal blooms of the men currently melting through the steel shutters. In the center of this lethal triangle sat Lucien, perched on the edge of a shattered chair, his silk tie loosened and his bravado finally, utterly, dissolved into the dust. The standoff at La Lanterna had reached its ultimate distillation. Weapons were leveled at every exit, but the most devastating barrel was pointed inward, toward the younger brother who had thought himself a king. Lucien looked at the freight lift, then at Julian's glowing tablet, and finally at the cold, granite face of his brother. The realization that he had been outplayed not by a rival family, but by a ghost in a waiter's vest, was a psychological blow that seemed to physically shrink him. His plan had been built on the assumption that Enzo was a fatting relic, a man blinded by sentiment and slowed by age. He had never imagined a counterintelligence web so deep that his every secret meeting and every stolen dollar had been logged before the ink was even dry. The exit fund he had stolen was no longer a prize. It was a weight that had pulled him into a trap he didn't have the intellect to escape. "You had it all, Lucien," Enzo said, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration that cut through the sound of the approaching thermite. "You had the name, the protection, and a seat at a table that most men would kill to even see, but you wanted the crown without the thorns." Enzo stepped closer, the shadow of his heavy build falling over Lucien like a shroud. "You thought Julian was just a boy with a tray. You thought Marco was just a dog on a leash. You forgot that in this house we don't buy people, we build them." Enzo's eyes were cold, reflecting the sickly orange light of the room. He didn't look like a man who had just been betrayed. He looked like a judge delivering a sentence that had already been recorded. The emotional style of the moment was one of absolute, frozen finality. The brothers were separated by more than just the mahogany table. They were separated by the fundamental difference between a man who knows the value of a secret and a boy who only knows the price of a bribe. Lucien's hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that caused his fingers to drum against the remains of the tablecloth. "Enzo, listen. The money is still in the car. We can go. We can take Julian and Marco and disappear," he stammered, his voice a high, thin reed of desperation. "The Morellos, they'll listen to me. I can tell them the deal is off." The bravado was gone, replaced by the pathetic, grasping logic of a man who realizes the floor has dropped out from under him. He looked at Marco, searching for a spark of the shared greed he thought they possessed, but the enforcer's gaze remained fixed on the door, cold and unwavering. Lucien's eyes flickered back to the freight lift, the iron gates sliding open with a heavy metallic clang. "Please, Enzo, I'm your brother. Don't leave me here with them." Enzo reached out and grabbed Lucien by the chin, forcing the younger man to look him in the eye. The proximity was suffocating, the smell of cordite and expensive wine mingling in the narrow space between them. "The brother I had died an hour ago, Lucien," Enzo whispered, the gravel in his voice raw and jagged. "The man sitting here now is just a thief who wears his face. You didn't just take the money, you took the only thing that made this life worth living. You took the trust." Enzo felt a profound, hollow ache in his chest, the final death of his blind loyalty. He saw the sweat pouring down Lucien's face, the way his eyes darted toward the front door as the first Morello breaching charge detonated, sending a shockwave through the floor. The standoff was reaching its boiling point, and the tactical window Julian had created was closing. Julian looked up from the tablet, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. "Sir, the Morellos are through the shutters. 10 seconds to breach. The freight lift is the only way out." Marco shifted his position, his weapon now pointed toward the front of the restaurant, waiting for the first shadow to cross the threshold. The packing of the room accelerated, the slow-motion tragedy of the dialogue being overtaken by the frantic, kinetic energy of the escape. Enzo didn't let go of Lucien's chin. He held it until the first Morello hitman appeared in the smoke of the doorway, then he shoved his brother back into the chair. Lucien fell with a sharp cry, his arms flailing, his silk jacket catching on a piece of broken crystal. He was a portrait of total collapse, a man who had sold his soul for a kingdom and ended up with a handful of ash. The weapons leveled in the room were no longer part of a standoff. They were the tools of a retreat. Enzo signaled to Marco and Julian to move toward the lift. The Last Supper was finally being cleared away. As the first burst of Morello fire shredded the velvet curtains, Enzo took a final look at the restaurant he had loved. He saw the empty wine bottles, the blood-stained napkins, and the brother who had outplayed himself. The subtext of death was now an overt roar. Lucien scrambled toward the lift, his hands reaching for the iron bars, but Enzo stepped in front of him, his heavy frame blocking the path. "You wanted to be the boss, Lucien," Enzo growled, the emergency lights flickering one last time. "A boss stays with his crew, and your crew is coming through that front door right now." The freight lift gates began to close, the iron mesh sliding shut like the teeth of a trap. Lucien screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that was drowned out by the crash of the Morellos entering the room. He realized in that final second that he had never been a player. He had always been a pawn, and the board was being folded up around him. Enzo Valenti stood in the lift, his hand on Marco's shoulder, his third eye by his side. The transformation was complete. The king was leaving his palace, not in defeat, but in a tactical withdrawal that would allow him to burn the city down from the outside. As the lift descended into the basement, the last thing Enzo saw was Lucien standing in the center of La Lanterna, alone in the orange light, as the men he had hired came to collect the debt he could never pay. The freight lift descended into the damp, subterranean silence of the basement, leaving the roar of the Morello submachine guns behind like a receding storm. The iron cage shuddered to a halt, and Julian Thorne immediately stepped out, his tablet casting a ghostly blue light against the weeping concrete walls. Behind him, Enzo Valenti emerged from the shadows of the lift, his heavy footsteps echoing with the finality of a funeral march. Marco followed, dragging a sobbing, broken Lucien by the collar of his ruined silk jacket. The younger brother was a hollow shell of the man who had sat at the head of the table. His arrogance had been replaced by a frantic, animalistic desperation that caused him to stumble and trip over his own feet. They reached a reinforced steel door that led to the city's forgotten utility tunnels, a labyrinth Enzo had mapped decades ago as his final insurance policy. Marco shoved Lucien against the cold concrete, the enforcer's weapon leveled at his chest with a terrifying mechanical steadiness. Lucien sank to his knees, his hands clasped in a prayer that arrived 20 years too late. "Enzo, please," he whimpered, the sound bouncing off the low ceiling. "I'll give it all back. The money, the codes, everything. Just don't leave me to the Morellos. I'm your blood. You can't kill your own blood." The subtext of the moment was heavy with the expectation of a single, decisive shot to the head. In their world, betrayal of this magnitude carried only one currency of settlement. Marco looked to Enzo, his finger tightening on the trigger, waiting for the slight nod that would end the Valenti civil war. The emotional style of the night had reached its chilling nadir. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and the impending arrival of a fratricidal end. Enzo stepped into the light of Julian's tablet, his face a mask of ancient, weathered granite. He looked down at his brother, but he didn't see a rival or a traitor. He saw a boy who had never understood that power without honor is merely a slow-acting poison. Enzo reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain, nondescript envelope and a single, one-way bus ticket to a town in the Midwest that didn't even appear on most maps. He dropped them into the dirt at Lucien's feet. "I'm not going to kill you, Lucien," Enzo said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that carried more weight than a death sentence. "Killing you would be too easy. It would make you a martyr in your own twisted mind. It would give you a place in our history, even as a villain." Enzo leaned down, his eyes boring into Lucien, with a cold, absolute clarity. "I'm choosing something much worse for you. I'm choosing insignificance." Lucien stared at the bus ticket, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this?" "Enzo, I can't go there. I have nothing there." The younger brother's voice was a thin reed of disbelief. Enzo's jaw tightened, his gaze never wavering. "That's the point. From this moment on, you are no longer a Valenti. You are no one. You will live in a world where no one knows your name, where no one fears your shadow, and where the only thing you have to look forward to is a shift at a gas station and a quiet room in a boarding house." Enzo reached down and snatched the gold signet ring from Lucien's trembling hand, the metal clicking against his own rings. "You wanted to be free from the museum. Now you are. You're free from the money, the protection, and the family. You are officially a ghost, Lucien. And ghosts don't get to have a say in the world of the living." The mercy of the boss was a calculated, psychological execution. Enzo realized that for a man like Lucien, who craved the spotlight and the status of the crown, living a life of utter mediocrity was a fate more agonizing than a bullet. To be forgotten was the ultimate torture for a man who had sold his soul to be remembered. Lucien began to wail, a sound of pure, ego-shattering grief, realizing that he was being stripped of the only identity he had ever known. He wasn't being executed, he was being erased. Marco lowered his weapon, the confusion on his face slowly turning into a grim appreciation for the boss's wisdom. A dead brother is a tragedy, a forgotten one is a nonentity. The tactical balance had shifted from the physical to the existential. "Julian has already purged your digital existence," Enzo continued, his tone devoid of any lingering affection. "The Morellos think you died in the restaurant. The feds think you fled the country. If you ever try to contact anyone from this life, if you ever step foot back in this city, or if you ever use the Valenti name again, Julian will see it. And then the mercy ends." Enzo signaled to Marco to open the steel door. A cold, damp draft blew in from the tunnels, smelling of wet stone and the lonely dark. "Get out, Lucien. Go live the small, quiet life you were always meant for. Spend the next 40 years wondering if today is the day I change my mind." Lucien scrambled to his feet, clutching the envelope and the ticket as if they were shards of his broken soul, and vanished into the darkness of the tunnel without a backward glance. Enzo stood at the threshold, watching the shadows swallow the last of his family. The transformation was complete. He had saved his brother's life, but he had destroyed his brother's world. He felt a profound, hollow ache in his chest, the weight of a man who had finally realized that being a leader meant standing in a room with no one else left. The Last Supper had ended with a single survivor and 1,000 regrets. Julian Thorne stepped up beside him, the tablet still glowing. "He's on the grid for the bus station, sir. I'll track him until he crosses the state line." Enzo nodded, his hand resting heavily on Julian's shoulder. The boy was the only legacy he had left, a shadow protector who understood that the most powerful move a king can make is to refuse to play the game his enemy expects. The bill for the night had been settled, but the cost was astronomical. Enzo Valenti turned away from the tunnel and began the long walk toward the surface, toward a city that was about to find out what happens when a boss has nothing left to lose. He had lost his brother, his wealth, and his peace, but he had kept his honor. He looked at the gold ring back on his own hand and felt the cold, hard reality of his new existence. He was the lone wolf of the East Side, and the night was just beginning. The mercy of a boss was a heavy burden, but as he stepped out into the rain of the alleyway, Enzo felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. He was no longer a family man. He was just a man, and that made him more dangerous than ever. The cold rain of the city washings over Enzo Valenti as he emerged from the subterranean dampness of the tunnels, but he did not feel the chill. The air in the narrow alleyway behind La Lanterna smelled of wet asphalt and the lingering, ghostly scent of the thermite that had breached his kingdom. He stood for a moment, the heavy collar of his overcoat turned up against the wind, looking at the brickwork of the restaurant that had served as his throne room for 20 years. It was no longer a palace. It was a crime scene, a hollowed-out shell of a life he had outgrown in the span of a single agonizing dinner. Beside him, Julian Thorne remained a silent digital specter, the blue light of the tablet finally fading as the third eye transitioned from tactical surveillance to the quiet observation of a survivor. The Last Supper was finished, the betrayal had been processed, and the only thing remaining was the settlement of the final debt. Enzo turned to Julian, the young man who had risked everything to be the shadow protector Enzo hadn't even known he needed. The boy stood with a discipline that surpassed his years, his waiter's vest stained with marble dust and soot, yet his gaze was clear and unwavering. Enzo reached into his inner jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon or a ledger. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope, the last of the cash he had kept in his personal emergency reserve, separate from the tainted exit fund Lucien had pillaged. It was more money than a waiter would see in 10 lifetimes, a massive tip that carried the weight of a life saved. He pressed the envelope into Julian's hand, his thick fingers lingering for a second on the boy's palm. It wasn't just a payment for services rendered. It was a dowry for a future away from the blood and the ink of the Valenti name. "Go, Julian," Enzo said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate with a newfound, weary peace. "The bill for your father's loyalty was paid long ago, and tonight you've overpaid your own. This city has a way of swallowing ghosts, and I won't have you becoming one of them." Julian looked at the envelope, then back at the man who had been the sun of his universe since childhood. For a moment, the professional mask of the third eye flickered, revealing the young man who had simply wanted to do right by his father's memory. He didn't thank Enzo with words. He simply nodded, a sharp, respectful inclination of the head that acknowledged the finality of the moment. Julian stepped back into the shadows of the alley, moving with the practiced invisibility of a ghost, and vanished into the city's indifferent embrace. The shadow protector was gone, and for the first time in 40 years, Enzo Valenti was truly alone. Marco stood a few paces away, his weapon holstered but his body language still tuned to the frequency of combat. He watched as Enzo adjusted his gold signet ring, the crest now facing the world with a defiance that no amount of Morello lead could shatter. The enforcer didn't ask about the money or the brother they had left in the dark. He simply waited for the next command. But Enzo didn't give one. He looked at the rain-slicked street, where the flashing lights of the delayed police response were finally beginning to paint the buildings in rhythmic pulses of red and blue. The bill had been paid in full, not just with the cash handed to Julian, but with the sacrifice of the only family Enzo had left. He had traded a treacherous brother for a clean conscience, and a sprawling empire for the simple, terrifying clarity of the truth. The packing of the night had slowed to a steady, rhythmic thrum. Enzo began to walk toward the mouth of the alley, his heavy footsteps splashing through the puddles. He didn't look back at the wreckage of La Lanterna. He didn't think about the empty vault or the rival crews who were currently celebrating a victory that was actually a hollow defeat. He thought about the Midwest town on the bus ticket, imagining his brother sitting in a cheap plastic chair, watching the cornfields blur past, a man who had been granted the mercy of being forgotten. The subtext of the entire evening, the struggle between the Blood and the Benjamins, had been resolved in the only way it could, with the total dissolution of both. Enzo was no longer the boss of the East Side, and he was no longer the protector of the Valenti line. He was simply a man walking out into the night, a figure of granite moving through a world made of rain and shadows. The emotional arc of the Last Supper had reached its final, quiet resolution. There was no grand explosion, no cinematic final stand, just the somber reality of a bill settled and a table cleared. Enzo reached the sidewalk and paused, looking up at the dark, indifferent sky. He felt the weight of his years, the phantom pains of every wound he had ever received, and the strange, light sensation of a heart that no longer had anything to guard. He had been a leader, a brother, and a king, and he had found that each role was merely a different kind of shackle. As he stepped out onto the main thoroughfare, blending into the late-night traffic of the city, he looked like any other older man heading home after a long, expensive meal. The diamond on his ring caught a stray spark of street lamp light, a final, defiant glint of the power he had once wielded. Enzo Valenti walked until the sirens faded and the smell of the restaurant was replaced by the neutral scent of the river. He had no destination, no crew waiting in the shadows, and no vault to return to. He had only the honor he had salvaged from the ruins, and the knowledge that he had remained true to a code that the rest of the world had forgotten. The Last Supper was over, the tip had been left, and the night was finally silent. He disappeared into the fog, a lone wolf moving through a city that would wake up tomorrow to find its king gone, leaving nothing behind but the memory of a dinner where the most expensive thing on the menu had been the truth. 10 years had a way of smoothing the jagged edges of a man's soul, much like the tide eventually rounds the sharpest stones on the shore. In a small, coastal town 300 miles from the sirens and the concrete canyons of the East Side, Enzo Valenti lived a life defined by the rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic and the quiet dignity of a man who no longer had anyone to command. He was known to the locals simply as Lawrence, a retired stone mason with heavy hands and a gaze that seemed to look through the horizon rather than at it. His empire was now a modest wooden cottage with a porch that creaked under the weight of the salt air, and his only board of directors was a stray dog that had wandered into his yard 5 winters ago and never found a reason to leave. The gold signet ring was gone, tucked away in a velvet-lined box beneath his bed, replaced by the simple, clean lines of a life lived in the light. On this particular evening, the sun was dipping below the water, painting the sky in the same bruised purples and deep oranges that had once flickered in the emergency lights of La Lanterna. Enzo sat in his high-backed wooden chair, a glass of water, not wine, resting on the railing. The air smelled of brine and pine needles, a scent that carried none of the metallic tang of cordite or the suffocating weight of betrayal. He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small, weathered photograph, the edges soft and fraying from a decade of touch. It was a picture taken 30 years ago at a wedding in Queens. In it, Enzo stood tall, his arm draped over the shoulder of a much younger Lucien. They were both laughing, their faces unlined by greed or resentment, two brothers who believed that the world belonged to them because they were standing together. Enzo traced the silhouette of his brother's face with a thumb that still bore the faint scars of his youth. He often wondered about the man in the Midwest, the ghost who worked at a gas station and slept in a boarding house, the man who had been stripped of the Valenti name to save the Valenti soul. He wondered if Lucien ever looked at the moon and felt the same hollow ache of a limb that had been surgically removed to save the rest of the body. There was no anger left in Enzo, only a profound, quiet mourning for the boy Lucien had been before the exit fund became a shackle. He had lost his brother to save himself, and in the silence of his retirement, he understood that the mercy he had shown was the heaviest burden he had ever carried. It was a shadow that followed him through the quiet streets of the town, a reminder that the cost of honor is often a lifetime of solitude. Every year on the anniversary of that final dinner, a small, nondescript envelope arrived at the local post office addressed to the man on the porch. There was never a return address, but inside, Enzo always found a fresh $5 bill and a brief, handwritten note. "The next generation is watching. Thank you for the rules." It was the only connection he maintained to the world he had left behind, a signal from Julian Thorne, who had grown from a third eye into a guardian of the neighborhood in his own right. Julian had taken the lessons of the Last Supper and used them to build something Enzo never could, a community protected by respect rather than fear. Enzo would fold the $5 and place it in a jar on his mantle, a growing treasury of a different kind. It was the only wealth that mattered now, a currency of gratitude that no thief could ever steal. The dog shifted at his feet, letting out a soft sigh as the last of the light vanished. Enzo tucked the photograph back into his pocket, close to his heart. He wasn't the central-seated man anymore. He was just a man, and for the first time in 60 years, that was enough. He had walked out of the cage of his own making and found that the world was vast and indifferent to his sins. The subtext of his life had shifted from a tragedy of power to a poem of peace. He stood up, his knees protesting the movement, and looked out at the dark expanse of the ocean. He was the lone wolf, but he was no longer hunting. He had paid the bill, left the tip, and found that the night was finally, truly silent. As he turned to go inside, he felt the weight of the photograph against his ribs, a reminder that some things are worth losing everything for, especially if what you find is yourself.